Good day. Hello. Jó napot kívánok. My name is Peter Hallis, and as a Holocaust survivor from Budapest, I was asked by Yad Vashem to provide an introduction to this conversation and commemorative event being held today on the anniversary of the liberation of the ghetto in Pest by the Red Army.
János, yes.
I was born in Budapest in 1939, and in March 1944, when Germany occupied Hungary, my mother and I went into hiding with an Armenian family friend. The last time I saw my mother was when she kissed me goodbye before visiting her parents, as it was my grandfather's birthday on the 15th of December 1944. And they were hiding in different locations. My mother and my maternal grandparents were rounded up by the Hungarian Nazis from their hiding place, and with other Jewish people in their building taken to the Danube, where they were shot. There's a plaque commemorating them on the Australian wall in the memorial cave at Yad Vashem. When the people hiding me found out what had happened, they sought a new place for me to hide, further from the center of the city. A young couple on Budapest outskirts hid me and looked after me. At the end of the war, my paternal grandmother found me and brought me to live with her. She survived the war in the Budapest ghetto. My father returned after being held in multiple camps, including Bergen-Belsen in June or July 1945, and the surviving family was able to reunite. Life began again, albeit with a limited food supply and restricted freedoms under the communist government in Hungary. The new government was not much more benevolent than the Nazis were. In 1956, some friends and I escaped Austria, and life in the free world began. I immigrated to Australia in 1957, speaking no English, with no family, and not much more than the clothes on my back, and started to work as a laborer. Once I found my feet and I learned English, I started working in the fashion industry, and in 1975, established the swimwear company Seafolly together with my wife. In 1960, I married Yvonne, and we had 2 children. In the mid-1970s, my brother, father, and my father's second wife managed to leave Hungary and immigrated to Australia to join me. I have a Jewish prayer book, which belonged to my paternal grandmother. A record of my family's birth, death, and marriages have been recorded inside its cover, and I have carried on this tradition, continuing to record the birth of my own grandchildren, there are 6 of them. And now, for today's event, Richelle Kaplan, who is the Director of International Relations and Projects at Yad Vashem's International School for Holocaust Studies in Jerusalem, will be interviewing Dr. Chava Baruch, who was born in Hungary, the only daughter of a Holocaust survivor parents who lived under the communist regime in the early 1960s. Until she was 13, when Chava and her mother moved to Israel, Chava didn't know that she was Jewish or that she had family members who were murdered in the Holocaust. Having learned Hebrew, and after graduating high school, Chava served in the Israeli Defense Force. She completed her BA at the Faculty of History at Tel Aviv University, and then wrote her MA thesis, The Ghetto of Budapest in 1944, at the Faculty of Commemorative Jewry at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Following this, Chava completed her PhD thesis entitled The Self-Perception of the Leaders of the Neolon Community of Budapest Between the Two World Wars. A high school history teacher, Chava also worked at Yad Vashem for over 20 years, organizing and implementing seminars of Holocaust education at the International School for Holocaust Studies for teachers from Israel and various European countries, including Hungary, Romania, Croatia, Serbia, and Slovenia. Additionally, she volunteered in the Righteous Among the Nations Department of Yad Vashem. Since her retirement from Yad Vashem in 2016, Chava is now an expert translator of Holocaust-related documents from Hungary to Hebrew and English. Over to you, Rochelle.
Well, good day, everyone. Thank you so much for this special introduction, Dr. Hallas. It is an honor to have you, together with others from around the world, with us today. And shalom and greetings from the Mountain of Remembrance in Jerusalem. Before we begin, please allow me to remind everyone to mute themselves in order to ensure that we can hear our guest scholar well. I would also like to note that if you have a question, please feel free to post it in the chat. We will relate to your questions toward the end of today's online session. So without further ado, Shalom Chava. Thank you for joining us today as we commemorate what happened 76 years ago in the capital of Hungary, the place you were born. Chava, Yad Vashem's Holocaust History Museum opens with pre-war Jewish life. Can you please provide us with a brief description about Hungarian Jewish communities before the Second World War? Chava, please.
Okay, so I would like to thank Mr. Hallas for his personal story, because I think this is the most important part of the whole story here, and we have to combine it with the historical facts. So relating to your question, the Hungarian Jewry, you know, many times people ask me, tell me, Chava, is it a typical Eastern European Jewry or a Western European Jewry? And the answer is exactly, it is the junction between, the Hungarian Jewry is a junction between the Western and the Eastern Jewry. So it is not the typical status that you can see in the eastern part of Europe, and it is not the typical Jews from Berlin, but it is a mixture. And just some numbers, because we need to know it. We are talking about around 900,000 Jews before First World War, and a little bit more than 850,000 Jews after the First World War. We are talking about almost 200,000 Jews in Budapest. So this is the biggest community in Hungary. And I just want to give you some characteristics. We are talking about 66% of those Jews were Neo-Law Jews. I will explain. 26% of them were Orthodox Jews, and only 4 or 5% of them were Zionist Jews, and 5% of them were what we call the status quo Jews. So just to explain the difference very briefly, the Orthodox Jews were those traditional Jews who were following the traditions for all the years that we know. And the Neo-Law Jews, we are starting to talk about them from 1868, when this Jewry was totally divided for two main trends. And the Neo-Law Jews were those who were following the modern way, those who were seeking for acculturation and assimilation. And we have a lot of Jews that were other Jews, radical Jews, communist Jews, or even converted Jews. But most of the Hungarian Jews were very connected to the Hungarian culture. They called it the double connection, even more than affiliation, double connection. It was very, very important for them from the 19th century. That was actually the golden age of the Hungarian Jewry, and after the First World War, it changed. So what do you mean double connection? It means that they very, very admired the Hungarian culture and the language, and they wanted to be part of it. So they learned the Hungarian language. They almost changed the whole education system accordingly. But in the other hand, it doesn't mean that they forgot their Jewish identity. And this is what was special for the no-log Jews. No-log means the new ways, those who are going in the new way for modernization. They didn't converted their religion. They didn't left their Jewish identity, but they saw it and they explained it as a kind of a cultural heritage. They were very proud of their Jewish cultural heritage. In the other hand, they were very proud to be part of the Hungarian and the European culture. Now, this is, according to the emancipation, was very successful during the 19th century, but it was very problematic in the 20th century. In the 20s, in the 30s, when Hungary became an independent state after the First World War, and not the part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where you had a lot of nations and religions, and it was a different era. Now, when there is a new Hungarian state, the Hungarians had to rebuild their whole national identity and organizing this new state that they had. And it was very problematic because they didn't get everything they dream about, but only a small part of the historical Hungary in the borders of the Trianon Treaty in 1920, which was very, very painful for the Hungarians since they lost many part of the historical borders of Hungary. So now the main issue for the Hungarians was, who are we the Hungarians without the Austro-Hungarian Empire? So the first thing they claimed, Hungarians have to be Christians. Okay, so if that's the story, what about the Jews? Where are they going there, staying? Who are they? So the whole emancipation became very, very problematic. And unfortunately, or I don't know how to say this, most of the Hungarian Jews believe that it can be combined together and they still can be part of the Hungarian society. But it was very interesting how the no-log leadership tried to deal with this problem. Since following the emancipation, there were a lot of Jews who totally left the Jewish identity. So it became a new generation that hardly knew anything about Jewish heritage or cultural history. I'm not speaking about the Orthodox Jews who remained very faithful, so it was not a problem for them. They had other problems. So the no-log leaderships actually tried to rebuild this cultural heritage. They had a lot of cultural and social activities. They had wonderful newspapers that started in the 19th century, like Egyenlőség, which means equality, with Szabolcsi Lajos. And in these newspapers, for example, they fight for their rights that were deprived of them later on. So they have a lot of newspapers in the Hungarian language. And Mr. Halas remind me when you talked about your preach book, okay, your book, a prayer book, okay? I wonder which language this prayer book was written, because many of the Hungarian Jews, just like in other European countries, they already didn't understand their Hebrew, the prayer. So they translated
You're quite right, it was in Hungarian.
It was in Hungarian. And I saw in the archives a lot of documents like this, and they were praying for, in Hungarian language, beautiful Hungarian language, for the sake of Franz Josef, the Kaiser Franz Josef, for the sake of his family, from the sake is his administration. And in the same way, they prayed for the sake of Horthy until the end, until 44. And here we can see this tragedy of this Hungarian Jewry that later on we will talk about it, how they were totally disappointed and abandoned by this Hungarian government and country that they believed in. So I think that if we are summarizing, the Budapest Jews were the leaders of the Hungarian Jews. Although there were split, the Orthodox and Neo-Lodge, we have to understand it. The leadership was the Hungarian Jews was actually from Budapest, the Budapest Neo-Law community. Now, the Zionists, why we have so few Zionists, we have to understand. And it is connected with this double connection that the Hungarian Jews believed in. They believed that there are very good Hungarians. So this is my nationality and my cultural heritage, my religion is Jewish, but I am an Hungarian. Yes, you will say just like in Germany, and I will say sometimes even a little bit more, okay? So the Zionism is the national movement of the Jewish identity. So they couldn't choose it because then you have to leave Hungary and go to Israel. And for them, even Zionism was a cultural trend. So students of the Jewish gymnasium in the Abonistry, they were visiting, for example, in 1938, Israel, Eretz Israel. They came back. They didn't sat down there. They didn't remain in Israel because it is a wonderful land. I remember this is part of my cultural heritage, but my home is at Hungary. And I think that we are stopping here.
Well, Chava, you're actually, it's important that you mention 1938 because, and I think that it can be considered a turning point. Certainly it's often considered a fateful year, as you well know, and most of the audience does, for the Jews in the Third Reich. But how would you call 38? Was it in Hungary? Was it also a turning point for Hungarian Jews as well, and why?
Okay, so we are talking about 1938, okay, and etc. In a way, it was a turning point, but it was not totally new. It was a turning point because from 1938 we have an anti-Jewish legislation by the Hungarian governments. And I would like to repeat, by the Hungarian governments. Hungary was not occupied yet by the Nazis, by the Nazi Germany. So it is very important to understand that all those anti-Jewish legislations, which already started in 1920 with the numerus clausus, when the Jewish students were rejected from the universities, they ran away to Berlin. It is very interesting. In 1920, they went to learn in Berlin. But let's come back to Hungary. So from 1938, the ruler is the Admiral Horthy Miklós. And he was an admiral, and you called him the regent, which means that he wanted to be like a king, but since he has no an official dynasty in his family, so he was called regent. But we have to understand, many times we were asking, Horthy is like Hitler, like Mussolini, not like Hitler and not like Mussolini. Horthy is Horthy, which means that he was the ruler of Hungary, no doubt about it. It was an authoritarian state. He could choose the government, and everything he wanted to do, he could do in Hungary. But there was still a parliament and there were parties. So it looked like a liberated country, but a liberal country, but it was far away of a liberal country. So from 1938, and again, I would like to remind, and then to talk about the Jewish problem here. For the Hungarians, the most important thing was in that time, how to change this Trianon Treaty. This was the most important thing for them. And who can help them for this? Okay, so we have to remember that Hungary was and is in Central Europe, between Germany, Austria, and between the East. So the closest neighbors were the Germans, not USA and not England. Okay, just to keep in mind. Okay, because otherwise we will ask the wrong questions, which will be no answers. So, not to speak about other terrible problems in the Hungarian society, but we have no time for this. Anyhow, from 1938, we have anti-Jewish legislation, which means, like, you know, it was gradually built, and it was like the Nuremberg laws, which means the Jews were slowly, or not slowly, deprived of their rights that they had from the emancipation. But it was very, very confusing. It means that the Jews can't work as lawyers and doctors, etc., couldn't buy lands, etc. You know this, so I'm not going to the details. But we had three of them, 1938, 39, and 41. Very important to remember that most of the men, the Jewish men between age 18 and 50, who had to recruit to the army, to the Hungarian army, that they were very proud to be part of the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War. And they have their medals that they kept and were very proud of this. It didn't help a lot. So all those Jewish men were recruited to the army, but without their ranks, without their uniform, and that's what we call they were recruited to the forced labor, because Horthy believed that they can be reliable. They are Jews, okay? So you can give them the Hungarian flag or a gun, etc. So they had to come and to give up their uniforms if they had before. And now they are recruited and going to the forced labor with their own clothes, with shoes. And first they were working inside Hungary, but from 41, thousands of them were taken to the Eastern Front, to USSR, where thousands of them were killed and hurt, and not just because of the war. Sometimes and many times by the cruelty of their Hungarian officers or soldiers that were in charge of them. So the men are not at home. And it is very important to understand, I'm not talking about 100%, but at least 80% of the Jewish men are not at home. Okay, so then in the other hand, still we try to understand what is that they could do or they hear, but it will be the next question, okay?
Well, it's important that you do mention, thank you, Chava, for providing that important context, because we are going to start moving into the 1940s now. And by the way, for those who are interested in to learn more about the forced labor battalions, we have another talk that is also recorded on our website, which we can send information to you later if you're interested. So Chava, here we are. What did the Jewish community in Budapest hear about the murder of Jews in the East? I mean, what did they know about Nazi German death camps in Poland? Okay. What did they really understand or even hear at that time?
I just will add one sentence to the previous question. Anyhow, although there was a turning point in 38 and the anti-Semitic laws were on the way, in the other hand, everyday life of the Jewish people were not totally changed. So most of them were at home and still could go on with their life. It is important to remember, because this was not the situation in other parts of Europe. Now I'm coming to your question. What did they know? So generally speaking, I just want to remind us, Hungary was not occupied until March 44. Try to remember what happened in Europe from 1938, Czechoslovakia, later on Poland, etc. Most of Europe are occupied by Nazi Germany. Hungary was still not occupied. So it is a different situation. So what the Jewish people knew? Look, they heard a lot of rumors. And I would like to keep in mind a sentence of one of my students, because we forget the situation. We try to think about them, but we are thinking with our mind what we have today. One of my students asked me very seriously, Chava, I can't understand how come they didn't send an email from Auschwitz. This is what he asked me very seriously, because this is our life today. Email, Zoom, TikTok, tuk-tuk, name it, okay? We have to remember that it was a totally different situation in a closed country. No borders, no open radios. You had one official channel and you heard what they said you. The same with the newspapers. I'm translating a lot of new newspapers for that time from Hungary. It's terrible to read it. And it is very interesting how they refer to the front. Even in 44, well, we are winning, we are okay, everything is fine. Try to understand what's true and not, okay? How many deaths and no, nothing. So the Jewish people, they heard about some terrible rumors from the East, because their men sometimes could write some letters, or they came home, those who came from the forced labor, Munkasol Galat. They told about them, look, that's what I saw here, that's what I heard here. I saw Jews with yellow star. But they couldn't see the whole picture. Even if they heard about Auschwitz, they couldn't understand the system. Nobody understood, actually. We have to tell about. Now, I would like to give you a personal examples of my family, not because this is the most important thing, but because it is my family, and I think that it will explain you. My grandfather was 46 years old at that time, and he was a widow, and he had 7 children between age of 22 and 11. From 1933, he went to the synagogue and he tried to warn the people, look, I heard what's happening in the East and the killing, etc. They just sent him away, go away, don't come back. We don't want to hear about it. It can be true. We are here in the center of Europe. We are under the rule of the gentleman Horthy Miklos, Uriember, gentleman. It is more than gentleman. It is an Uriember, okay? So he won't let it happen here. So nobody believed to my grandfather. One of the sisters of my mother, she was the member of the Zionist movement from the age of 11. It was an Orthodox family, so to be a member of a Zionist movement, it was terrible for this family, but not for this wonderful lady. And she was there in the Zionist movement, and she heard from her leaders, okay, or her teachers, what's happening in the East, and what can we do if it will happen here? The maximum they could think about it is to run to Budapest with Aryan papers. And that's what she did. I will talk about it later on. But my grandfather stayed with her 3 children at home. For the 4th children, they had some papers and they ran away to Budapest. My grandfather they were 11 brothers and sisters. Part of them could hide by papers. One of them went to Budapest. But my grandfather stayed in Debrecen. So when the deportation arrived, he stayed with with 3 children, and this little one, the youngest girl, her name also was Rachel Chepike, she asked to run away. I want to run away. But my mother, who was then 20 years ago, and she always afraid of something, she said the grandfather said, okay, go, run away, because he knew what's going on. But my mother didn't let her run away. What are you talking about? She's a little girl. So this little girl with my grandfather arrived to Auschwitz and with my mother, and all of them were killed except my mother. So they knew. So what if they knew? And that's why always reminding me, it is the first question, what is that they knew? We have to go on. Who knew what, when, and where? And what is that he wanted to do? And what is that he was able to do? Because Horthy Miklos knew exactly what is the meaning of Auschwitz. In 1943 in Kelsheim, when he met Hitler, they were talking about him. Yes, Horthy was not so eager to do this, but he knew about it. You can't tell him he didn't know. So what is that he could do or wanted to do? Is it the same of my grandfather? Do I have to blame my uncles that they didn't help too much to my grandfather? I am not doing this. I can't blame the victim. I try to see, first of all, what is that they could do. So it is a very large and painful question. And the Hungarian Jewry were attacked, the survivors. How come you didn't understand? You are fool. How come you went to the wagons? Are you stupid? Okay, good questions from your home when your stomach is plenty of food and everything is okay. It's easy to ask questions. But to be there then, actually this jury was totally abandoned, and everybody tried to save his family, himself, as much as he could. But unfortunately, it was totally impossible and they were totally helpless.
Chava, thank you for shedding light on the context, on trying to provide us a picture. And now we get to the eve of what happens. March 19th, 1944. Germany, again, we're towards the end of the war, invades Budapest, invades Hungary. When was the ghetto established? Can you tell us? And what were the conditions like there in 1944 for the Jews in Budapest?
So we are going to the day, the big day, 19th of March, 44. You know, Rachel, I always told you for years, people were running after me because I was writing this date on my checks when I was buying something. It was I was not aware of this, so they were running. Chava, what's the, oh, sorry, okay. So the first question that we have to ask, how come that the Nazis decided to enter Hungary in the end of the war in March 44? Why not before and why at all? What happened? So actually we have to remind us and to keep in mind that Hungary joined in a treaty, Nazi Germany, in 1941, and joined also the attack on the USSR, which was a terrible historical mistake because almost 1 million Hungarian soldiers were killed there. Not to talk about the Jews, it is another story. Okay, from 43, the Hungarian governments and Horthy started to understand that the war won't end as we thought before. It's not so sure that the Germans will be the winners. So they tried to leave this treaty. It called kiugrás, leave this, to jump out. But the Nazis were not stupid and they were very aware of this attempts to kill Granny again. So they always looked at Hungary, what's going on, because they were the closest neighbor. This was the backyard of the Reich. So they needed this. So when they were invited in 1943, Horthy, Hitler and Horthy were met. He was a very serious conversation, and Hitler said, "You just try to do this, we will enter Hungary." So it is the end of the war. Germany needs Hungary as his backyard. Okay, now 19 March 1944. Although it was quite obvious that it could happen, it was a big surprise for all the Hungarians and the Jews especially. It was Sunday. You know, I had the privilege to know Hansi Brandt from the Kastner story. She was living in Tel Aviv, and she always told me the story that in that day, one of her neighbors was very busy of ironing something that it could be very, nice for other people were just in the street. So everybody was totally surprised. Oh, here are the Germans. But I also have to tell you that there was no any kind of rejection of this entering of the Nazis, not by the Hungarian army. One of my teachers, we will talk about some of the teachers that I worked with them, found a document in German language, which was spread out in Hungary in that time for the German soldiers. You know what is what? Nobody warned them, be aware of any kind of rebel or objection. No. How to deal with the mud if your car will be in the mud. This was the most important thing that they could sell. So it was a smooth entering to Hungary. So Hungary was then around 10 million people, population. And we, just for the numbers, 3,000 German Wehrmacht soldiers and only 300 Einsatzgruppen, those who were dealing with the Jewish question. So it was very clear for the Germans that they will have a very, very big help from the Hungarian authorities, and even though they were totally surprised. Okay, so they are entering Hungary, and actually, now all the orders were published in Hungarian by the Hungarian government. Because although the Nazis entered Hungary, it was not a total occupation like in Poland in 1939. The whole Hungarian authorities remained in their place. All the army, all the משרדים. Anyhow, the whole operation of the Hungarian government. So, in 56 days between March and 15th of May, the whole Jewry of the provinces, not Budapest, but all the other cities, were collected. All the Hungarian Jewry from April, 5th of April, with yellow star, all their property was confiscated. Believe me, when I'm translating those documents, you are going crazy. Up to the last shirt that the Jew had, they had to give it. So the Hungarian authorities there made a very official work then. So in 56 days, those Jews were forced to enter to the local ghettos, and those were also closed ghettos with the Choma.
They had borders or walls.
Borders, okay. And from the 15th of May, the deportation to Auschwitz started. every day more than 12,000 Jews on the trains, and there was a previous cooperation agreement between the German company of trains, between the Hungarian company of trains, MAV, and the Slovakian company on trains. So it went very quickly. So the Jews had no time at all to think about what to do, where to go. And from this part of time until the summer of 1944, more than 430,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz, most of them to Auschwitz. What about Budapest? Okay. And Budapest still remained around 200,000 Jews, among them a lot of Jews from the Munkaszolgálat, from the forced labor, who started to understand that it is a very, very hard situation and run away to Budapest. So I would like to say only one sentence about the Jewish leadership, because it is still a very complicated topic and we have to be very careful how to deal with this. They were accused of collaboration, cooperation. I'm not going to this question, but in that period of time, they knew also what is the meaning of deportation, what is that they could do. From the moment they were under the SS or the Nazi occupation and the Hungarian collaboration, that's it. They couldn't move. So the most important thing that they tried to do is to keep the Jews in Hungary. They were calling Horthy, who didn't answer them, etc. Please make something the Jews to leave them in Hungary. They wrote long reports with everything happening in the ghettos, how the Jews were beaten up and how their property was confiscated. They wrote, but nobody listened. So again, back to my family for arriving to Budapest. So my grandfather, my mother and her two, one of the brothers and the little sister were deported to Auschwitz. My grandfather knew exactly that this is Auschwitz. My mother is another story. Anyhow, as I told you, the little one also somehow felt she wanted to run away. We understand this. Now, the other sisters, 4 sisters and 1 brother between age of 22 and 15, they went, each one of them by himself, by herself, to Budapest. My aunt, a 70-year-old girl, she was never before in Budapest. She arrived to Budapest as not a Jewish one. How can she do this? And she did it. She went to rent a house, a room. She searched for some kind of work, for doing something. Okay, she has to eat. But in a moment that somebody told her, okay, you look like just this person, she understood that it was her brother. So she ran away. So it was a day by day fighting for survival. Now, most of the Jewish people in Budapest still were at their home in the summer. And I think that we will talk somehow about the Jewish ghetto. And now, Rachel, tell me if you want it now or the next question.
Well, why don't we, since we're at quarter to now, Chava, and I know that we can speak for many hours, and everyone who's with us now from all over the world realizes that you are the expert. I do want to start thinking about not just the ghetto, but after all, we're commemorating 76 years ago today, January 17th.
Okay.
So why don't you just give us a moment, a little bit more on the ghetto, and then let's start understanding more about what happens when
Budapest
the Soviets
ghetto.
come in. Exactly, and then the Soviets come in.
Okay, before this, okay, some words about Budapest ghetto. So in Budapest, actually, there were two types of ghettos. In the first part, the plan was ready already with the occupation by the Nazis, but it became a real option only in the summer. Please remember, summer, June 44, Rome was liberated, the landing to Normandy. So it is a total different kind of picture. The war is going to end. So the first part of the ghetto, what it was the Csillagos házak, which means Jewish houses in different roads of Budapest. There were Jewish houses with their yellow star, and only those places the Jews could live in a very, very restricted situation. You know, it was like curfew. They couldn't go out. Even to speak out from the window, it was forbidden. So it was very hard. In the first part, they were in those houses, okay? So there was no wall around, but it was like a wall, okay? And only Jewish people there, children, women. In the second part, there were the so-called international ghetto, or the protected houses, which were under the protection of the diplomatic forces and the
Swedish,
Red Cross, etc. Okay, so they were so-called protected Jews. Now, in November 44, end of November, no Auschwitz, because Auschwitz was closed in November. There is no place to send them away, okay, from the point of the Nazis. Salashi, this is a different point. We have to remember, in 15th of October, Horthy had a very important speech in the radio where he claimed that he ended with Nazi Germany. That's what he thought, not the Nazis, because he kept him and his son, and they made Szálasi as the leader of the Hungarian nation. Szálasi is the leader of the Arrow Cross. I'm not going to explain his whole ideology because we'll never end this meeting. And Szálasi is total pro-Nazi Germany. And then he decided that the remaining Jews will be put in a closed ghetto around the Dohány utca, Dob utca, Király utca, Veselényi utca, those streets, where is the big synagogue in Dohány utca, okay?
yes.
So and in the beginning, there were 30,000 Jews in this place. In the end of January, there were 70,000 living Jews, that they stay alive, okay? So in that part, this ghetto and all the people, it were terrible situation, because in the one hand, the Allies bombed Budapest. And this was one of the reasons that Horthy stopped the deportations in beginning of July 44. One of the reasons of the whole story ended in a different way. I don't think that it made Horthy righteous among the nations. It was a political interest, but good that he did it at all. Okay, and then we have to see what's happening later on. So in the ghetto, there were children's 700 children at least, women, old people. Part of those youngsters that were running away from the forced labor, they also were there. So it was a terrible situation, just we know from the ghettos, from Warsaw and any other place. And we have very interesting moments that you could see from the ghetto vis-a-vis the flag of the Red Army, but they were still under Nazi rule. So it was very close, since in the one hand, the Russians already were in Debrecen. In the other hand, it was a blockade on Budapest of the Russian, the Red Army. It was quite like in Stalingrad, okay? From house to house, it was a terrible fighting between the Nazis and their Hungarian collaborators and the Russian army. And then in between, there were fightings in the shelters. The shelters were the most terrible part of this whole story. People, the Jewish people in the ghetto, they couldn't even go to toilet. So, you know, we are talking, but try to imagine the smell, the crowdness, the whole helpless situation, and above all the fighting. So the survivors that I interviewed, they were talking about, they saw the Red Army fighting in the shelter with the Nazis. They could see, you know, like a movie, they could see this fighting from place to place in every house. And in the 70th of January, 80th of January, the Red Army liberated the ghetto of Budapest, but Budapest was liberated only in the 8th and 9th of February.
But we have a few photos. Alexis, would you share them? Because I think that you would be great if you could just explain a few of them, Chava. Alexis is going to share them now.
Okay, so
that everyone can see them on their screen.
The bridges that were broken, and you couldn't see, because you know, Budapest, there are two cities. The first was the ancient city was Buda on the hills, okay, in one side of the Danube River, and Pest only from the 17th century became the new city. So there were the beautiful bridges, and all of them were broken and collapsed, so you couldn't go from here to there. And you have to start everything from the beginning. And you could see the corpses of the horses on the street. People went out to get some part of this flesh to eat, terrible starvation. There was also a terrible phenomenon that people were so afraid, they had nothing, only their clothes. This is the picture that was taken by the photographer of Stalin. His name was Khaldai, and he saw this couple of Jews, and he was very surprised because he saw that he will never see again any Jews in Europe. And those Jews from the ghetto, you can see them at that moment when they were liberated. This is Szálasi Ferenc. He was executed in 1946, but his ideology is still alive, unfortunately.
Next one.
And here we can see how the people are coming out. You see that everyone tries to go here and there to find if their home, if their house is okay. What about their family? What about their family? This is what they try to find out. My mother also came back from Auschwitz. She wanted to give a present to her father. She's coming back to father. No father, no present, no nothing.
I'd like to.
This is the Dohányutca, okay? So it is the heart of the Jewish part of Budapest, and it is also, but we have another picture as well.
Well, this one thing.
This is the, you see, the Jewish gymnasium.
Well, before we start concluding, Chava, I wanted to bring you back. Actually, Alexis, can we go back to the first photo, and that's relating to the Danube. This session is called the Ghetto by the Danube. Many survivors have often said that the Danube was red. Could you focus on that for a moment before we wrap up?
Okay, because as I told, after closing Auschwitz, there was no place to deport the Jews out of Hungary. So part of them were sent by foot to the part of Austria for a building for the army, different kind of trenches who were sent, all Jewish women. They can do this. They were dying. Other part of the Jews were put to the Danube by the arrow cross, and they were shot into the Danube. So many times people asked me how many Jews were shot in the Danube, and I found very different numbers, between 2,000 and 20,000. Nobody can say exactly how many because they didn't write it down, but this was part of the arrow cross policy, which was terrible. And I know that many of the survivors can tell this story, that part of their family were shot to the Danube. Now, it was also interesting that those who were shot, part of them didn't die, they stay alive. They just were wounded. So they came out from the river, and the Hungarian policemen took them to the closed ghetto back. So very complicated. We don't have time to tell the whole story.
Exactly, which we'll have to have a different session
and
for that.
Anyhow, I just want to add, for the Jews, it was a real liberation from Nazi Germany by the Red Army, okay? Later on, there is a very big political and historical debate about the role of the Russians in this part of Europe, which is a legitimate debate, okay? If the communism is better and worse than Nazism, it is a historical debate. I'm not going into it. But we have to understand, for the Jews, at that moment, it was a real liberation. Later on, many of them understood that the Russians not necessarily love the Jews so much. It is another story, okay?
Alexis, I think you can take off the photos now. Just to remind all of us, if anyone has ever been to Budapest, and you've seen, of course, by the Danube, there's a very well-known monument there, which is actually very close to the beautiful parliament there on the Danube, which of course reflects what we've been talking about today. Chava, thank you so much. For many years, you trained educators from many countries on how to teach about the Holocaust, including hundreds from Hungary. And for those joining us today, approximately 800 Hungarian teachers have actually studied in Yad Vashem, not to mention those that you worked with in Hungary itself. Can you relate to some of your experiences working with European teachers from so many countries? And are you still in touch with them?
Yes, in part of them. Okay. So really it was my present of my life to work with those teachers, because we are talking about hundreds of wonderful people who are, many of them still going on and working and try to do something about the commemoration and teaching of the Holocaust. In part of them, I have very good friendly relationships. Yesterday, I got a letter from one of my teachers in Hungary, and she's still sending everything she's doing about it. It is wonderful. And actually, I think that we couldn't work without them. So it is the most important thing that we can do. And I think that I learned with them to make a difference between preaching and teaching. I learned with them to make a big difference, not to accuse, the whole nation, because it is never true. There were a lot of wonderful people who saved lives, and sometimes even just a smile that I'm feeling your pain, it is enough. And not to make this kind of mistake. And also, I think that I learned to listen to the pain of the persons. Especially it happened to me in ex-Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, where there were a lot of wars after Second World War. So when you can understand and when you are listening to their story, and I visited in a lot of killing sites, sometimes it was very hard, but I understood that if I want them to listen to our story, we have to listen to their story first. and then they can join us. Then we learn together not just to tell the story, but try to understand and to ask the questions. What kind of questions? You know, everybody is talking about Auschwitz, but what was the way to Auschwitz? You know, step by step, how did it happen? And not only Auschwitz, we made wonderful projects. We made, for example, also in Hungary, we went by foot. We were traveling all over Hungary. And we tried to see what happened here in this country, in your neighborhood. Because, you know, you are going to Auschwitz. Okay, you are going to Auschwitz. It is important. But you have a lot to learn and to understand very nearby you. And we learned it together. And we went together and tried to understand. And we learned to ask questions, not just giving answers, to ask questions. And not all the questions, actually most of the questions, you don't have a good answer. You have to learn more. Okay, so I think that I would like to finish this part with the moral dilemmas that we learn to analyze. What kind of choiceless choices those people had in that time? Not what I would do if I were there. I don't know. I would die. But what they did in that moment, in that situation, and what is that we can learn from this. And all those teachers helped me to do this day by day, and I'm really miss them very much. Each one of them.
You've made you made a significant impact, and clearly the educational trainings here at Yad Vashem have also, I think, made a lasting impact on so many teachers that you worked with, and we continue to work with, even online now when Yad Vashem school cannot have, unfortunately, teachers in its corridors. I think we have some time briefly for some questions that have been posted by our audience or some comments. For that, I'm pleased to call upon Seal Brightman, my dear colleague, who's the director of the English Language Desk in our International Relations Division, who will highlight some of those questions from our audience today. So Cyril, please take it from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle. Chava, we have a question from Marion Fixler. I'm interested in the anti-Semitic laws brought on in 1938. Was this in collaboration with Hitler? If not, how can this timing be explained?
Look, Hungarian, there is still a big debate between the historians about this part of the history of Hungary. And some of the Hungarian historians claims and will show you that it was a terrible pressure from Hitler to do this, to Horthy, which is partly true. We can't ignore this, okay? There was a very hard pressure from Nazi Germany on Hungary to do something about the Jewish question, okay? But in the end, as we say, it was the decision of the Hungarian government. And they were not under strict occupation yet in 1939. So it was a Hungarian policy.
Another question from Shirley Rudolph. I would like to find out more about those Jewish people who were afforded protection by organizations such as the Red Cross. Okay. I'm wondering why this was the case.
Okay, I'm wondering, but you know, it is such a long story. We can talk for at least 1 hour, much more, only about rescuing in Budapest in Hungary. And the Red Cross is only one of the organizations. We had so many others, like all those diplomats, Wallenberg, Perlaska, etc., and the Red Cross, Charles Lutz, and Born Friedrich, etc., and the Zionist underground movement, and the talkings with Eichmann. So we have so many topics. So we have to decide which one we are dealing with. This, okay? If we will have time, it's okay. But
well, somebody else actually asked they'd like to hear about the role of diplomats such as Roel Wallenberg. So why don't you just take a few minutes and talk about rescue in general?
Okay. So part of this sovereignty, that Hungarian sovereignty that still remained under Nazi so-called occupation, because the Hungarian authorities were still sovereign, and that's what important for Horthy. Part of this also that most of the diplomatic staff remained in Budapest, and they continued working. Okay, so Wallenberg came in summer 44 to Hungary, and actually he established a big organization. He was not totally alone, but he was the main leader of this trend, okay? And actually, the main issue he did was that he gave Schutzpass. Okay, how to say Schutzpass? Rachel, Schutzpass in English, please.
It's a pass that allowed people to not be deported.
Everybody needed some kind of paper, okay? So Wallenberg and other diplomats gave those papers, which meant officially that this Jew is under my protection, under the Wallenberg protection. And so the problem is that in the Szálasi era, didn't respect so much these papers. Sometimes they just threw it and, okay, so it is not an organized, beautiful thing that you can rely on. For example, from November, when the Jewish women, most of them from Budapest, were taken by Fußmarsch over Austrian border, Wallenberg went after them, traveled after them with his car, with these papers, and actually tried to save as much as he could. The Zionist movement, the young Zionist movement, they had clauses of the Nazi Arrow Cross party. So they also went and tried to save those who could save, okay? But it was not a solution for thousands and thousands. Those who could and succeeded, it was wonderful. But most of them were unsuccessful. About Wallenberg. In the end, Wallenberg, you know, he was so known, well known, even among the Hungarians and among the Nazis, that they wanted to kill him. They tried to kill him in an accident. He was saved several times. So this whole diplomatic defense was totally meaningless. It was not something that he could hide behind. He was sleeping every night in another apartment with Hungarian partners that he had. In the end of the war, after the Ghetto was liberated, he tried to reach the Russians for somehow to talk with them about keeping the Jews alive later on. He was captured by the Russians, and he disappeared, and nobody heard about him until the 80s. The youngsters among us can remember the 80s, that were some rumors that he's still alive in one of the prisons of the Russians, and he knocked on the wall. And, you have a lot of stories, okay? But one of my very good colleagues of historians in Hungary, he made a research. He was sitting in the Russian archives for years, and he discovered what happened to him. He was captured in 1945, and he was kept until 1947. And when Stalin understood that the Western world interested in him, he gave an order. No evidence, nothing happened. So he was invited, according to this research, to have some treatment in his tooth, professional, okay? And he got a poison injection and settled. So the Russians killed him in 1947. And the Western world still waited for him until the 80s. So we have so many stories that just give me time.
I think we have time for one one last question, a very short question, Chava, and that is, could Jewish lawyers practice law after 1938?
Not officially. Not officially. You know, you always have some ways out, okay? But officially, no. Officially, it was totally deprived of them, doctors, etc. Not officially. According to the law, not officially. What is that they could do? Among them, okay, among them, between the Jews, they can do what they could do, but not officially.
Okay, so as the time is marching on, I would just like to firstly thank Peter Hallis for sharing his personal story and making the introduction. Peter, thank you for your very moving words. And I would, of course, like to thank Chava for your very, very fascinating presentation. There are many, many compliments to you in the chat, and to my colleague, Rochelle Budd-Kaplan, for a fascinating questions and interaction with Chava. So folks, thank you so very much everyone for joining us today. We look forward to you joining us for future lectures as well. And this concludes the session today. Thank you very much for joining us.